One of the greatest experiences I had as a naval officer was to command the 7th Fleet, and to command it when I did, because I commanded it in warfare. And where the 7th Fleet was for years was in the Pacific, that's where the wars were fought. The 7th Fleet was very instrumental in carrying the Navy's flag in the Korean War, and of course in the war in Vietnam. It was even more instrumental in that many people don't realize it, but carriers provided more than half of the combat sorties into North Vietnam. And sometimes I'm challenged on that, but I can break out the official records. And the difference, people say, well, the Air Force flew a lot. They did fly a lot, but they tended to fly in country. In other words, their planes and helicopters and the Army's helicopters flew in support of our troops. Well, we didn't have any of our troops in North Vietnam. But what we had to do, we had to win the war by making North Vietnam feel the pressure of the United States. So that's where the war was going to be won or lost, in North Vietnam. And that's where the carriers flew their planes into North Vietnam. The majority, yes, the largest number of combat sorties. But another experience as command of 7th Fleet was the fact that the Joint Chiefs of Staff, probably due to some urging from our admirals back in Washington, decided that this was a great opportunity to show the capabilities of our ships to provide gunfire support. They were providing gunfire support, largely providing it to our troops fighting in South Vietnam, engaged against the enemy. It was really a substitute for the Army's artillery, was the Navy's gunfire. So I was rather surprised when I got a message from the Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific saying, in a week or so, as part of Operation Linebacker 2, which Henry Kissinger and the President have said is going to bring the North Vietnamese to their knees, we would like to see a gunfire strike against Haiphong Harbor installations, because at Haiphong there's the Cat Ba airfield, there are piers loaded with war supplies, and I think it would be great if we could show the world that our ships can go in there and shoot them up. Well, I said, my God, we got planes that fly over it every day. Don't you want to send planes in there? They said, no, we repeat, it's not so much what we do, it's how we do it. And doing it with cruisers and destroyers is very important. So I went back to the flagship and said to the Chief of Staff that this strike was on, probably in a week or so, to go into Haiphong Harbor and let them have it. And I said, let's get together and talk it over. And he said, Admiral, you know, you ought to stay out of it and let us surface warfare officers run it. And I said, well, I don't want to stay out of it. And he said, well, I mean, you know, but let us do all the planning. And you always throw your boys in there. And I made a mistake. And it was one that a lot of people would have made. They made a good case, which was they have specialists in cruiser and destroyer bombardment. But I made the case, I said, look, I know a little bit about this too, because in World War II, on a destroyer, that's what I did far more than you guys are doing down here. For example, the Benyon, in 1 week, emptied her magazines twice of 5-inch ammunition in supporting the Marines at Peleliu. So, you know, this is not science, this is not exotic stuff. So the answer was, but you go ahead and do it. So it was set up very quickly. And we would go in on August 27th, 1972, and it would be the Newport News, which is the only cruiser we had, I think maybe in the Navy, that still had 8-inch guns. Now they had a range of about 15,000 yards. So they could just barely, they could only reach into Haiphong Harbor a couple of miles, or a couple of thousand yards. So it was pretty dicey. Well, to go with the 8-inch gun cruiser, we had a 6-inch gun cruiser, the Providence, that was available. We added the Providence to the force, and plus 2 destroyers. Things happened in a hell of a hurry. I grabbed a helicopter and an aide and flew up to because I felt that we had to be, that I really had to go along on this. I was very concerned. One of the reasons I was concerned that if up there in Haiphong Harbor, one of our ships got a lucky hit in the engineering spaces and went dead in the water, it would have been shot to pieces, because the North Vietnamese were using field artillery, which can't hit a moving target, but boy, if that target becomes static, why, they'll just tear it apart. And my concern was we would be 300 miles behind friendly lines. Now, if one of our ships was bombarding in support of troops ashore, they'd be 4 miles offshore near Saigon with 100 U.S. ships around to come to the rescue. This case, in Haiphong, the nearest help would be, as I say, 300 miles away. And a ship that was sunk, one of ours in Haiphong Harbor, would be available to the enemy for exploitation. My personal fear and concern, which I couldn't talk about then, but I can now, was our policy in those days was neither to confirm nor deny whether nuclear weapons were aboard our ships. And that if the enemy got out there with their underwater divers and so forth, they would find out whether or not we had nuclear weapons. And I say whether or not, which would be very damaging to our policy. Well, I didn't bring this up because I thought the people, it was sort of telling the people in Washington and Hawaii how to suck eggs. I mean, it's something they ought to know, ought to come to mind, and I didn't want to be in the position of tapping them on the wrist. Well, things started at about 11 o'clock at night when the Newport News headed the column, followed by a destroyer, the Rowan, followed by the Providence, followed by the Robinson, and that was our force. And we steamed up to the point where they could see us coming either by radar or by visual sight by running up from the south. As we were coming up, though, something very important happened. I was stepped out on the wing of the bridge, and I looked over due west, and I saw the most remarkable sight. There were cones of tracers of anti-aircraft fire. I just couldn't believe it. These were the anti-aircraft guns in Haiphong and Hanoi shooting at U.S. carrier planes who were flying in to go further north up to the Chinese border and bomb. But the amount of firing that was done at just these, and you could know that they just had 1 or 2 planes, but that meant that there were naval aircraft in our vicinity. And I don't know why I sort of tucked that away back here. We went into the fight running east and west. We fired for 12 minutes, the 8-inch guns and the 5-inch guns, hitting Cat Ba. We hit an ammunition dump. We hit a gas dump. And then at the end of all our targets being covered with the allocated number of rounds, ceasefire, the gong rang, the captain said, right standard rudder, make speed for 26 knots, and he started out. Well, the destroyer that had been with us, rather than follow in our tail, just made a quick turn and so was in a position ahead of us getting out. I went down, I was standing next to the captain on the bridge, and I noticed one of the talkers tugging him on the sleeve, and he said, "Quiet, I'm talking to the Admiral here." And he said, "But sir, this CIC is calling, and they say that they have picked up 2 fast-moving targets coming out of the Katba naval base where we think they keep their OSA patrol craft." And I said, "Well, you better tell him right away." And sure enough, the captain did take that information. He passed it to the gunnery officer, and he said, "Take them under fire." Well, unfortunately, there went 3 or 4 minutes, and the 8-inch guns did not fire, nor did the 5-inch. And I said, "What's wrong?" And the captain says, "I don't know." And the guns aren't firing. So then he said, "Bad news, Admiral." He said, "The targets are in the forward quadrant of the ship. And on our last time in the shipyard, they put an aerial up in the bow. And in order to keep from shooting the aerial, we have an electrical cutout that keeps the guns from firing when they're on a forward bearing." And I said, "Well, unfortunately, that's where the targets are." So we maneuvered going to the right. We couldn't go far because that was all karsts, which are the little islands, and we'd have been aground in 3 minutes. We couldn't go north because that was the minefield that we had laid just 2 weeks before. We couldn't go west because that was Haiphong and Katba. So all we could do was go south. And south is where the patrol boats had ended up. And going south, we could go, but we couldn't shoot at the patrol boats. And we called the destroyer to tell them what was going on. And they said that they couldn't pick up the patrol boats because of the karst, that they gave the same kind of radar return as the patrol craft. And about that time, the talker came and said, "Sir, there are 2 more patrol boats coming out of the so-and-so estuary." And the captain looked at me, and and I said, I'm stepping in as Commander 7th Fleet. I said, "We've got a situation here that I'd like to clear up." And I said, "I'm taking tactical command. How can I call the aircraft that are overhead?" Nobody, that had not been written into the plan, communications plan. They hadn't counted on aircraft because they didn't think they'd need them. So I said, "Well, that's okay. This bridge setup is exactly the same as the bridge setup on my flagship, the Oklahoma City. And right over here should be a TBS." And sure enough, there was a TBS. And I picked it up and I punched the button that said guard. And then I spoke, and everybody within 20 miles would hear me on guard. And I said, "All aircraft in the vicinity of Haiphong, give me your attention. This is Blackbeard calling." I didn't think that we would know who Blackbeard was without looking it up in the op plan, com plan, but it was new and I sounded authoritative, and it was the call sign for Commander 7th Fleet. When I said, "This is Blackbeard," I said, "This is Blackbeard himself." And that seemed to lend credence to authentication of the call. I said, "We've gotten into a little skirmish with some PT boats and shore batteries down here off Haiphong, and we need some light to sort it all out. And we particularly need a plane with a 1,000,000 candle power flare." I don't remember the technical number, but at that time it was in my mind, 1,000,000 candle power. And one of the guys said, "Well, this is," the report came back, "this is Raven 1. I have 2 A7s. We both have your flares aboard. What would you like us to do?" And I said, do you see us down here?" And "This is Raven 2, affirmative. I was wondering what the hell was going on, and we can certainly help you out." And I said, "Roger, this is Blackbeard. Stay on this guard frequency. I don't want to lose contact with you. But go ahead and light things up and tell me what you see." So we could suddenly, the whole bay, coastal area, littoral, was lighted up by by two of these enormous flares. And the word came over the guard channel, this is Raven 1 again. I see your ship. I see a destroyer trying to catch up to you. There are two other ships that are going like hell south. What do you want us to do? I said, well, what weapons do you have? He said, I have Rockeye on board. I said, well, that's a good weapon. Go ahead and attack these PT boats. Have you found them? He said, oh, yes, I got 3 of them near you and 1 of them further north, a total of 4. And at that point, we just sort of watched because we couldn't, on the flagship, we couldn't really see well enough until the flares were in a certain position, which they did come in and lighted the flares, so the 8-inch guns on the flagship, as well as the bombs and bomblets from the carrier planes, rained down upon these gunboats, and 3 we were destroyed in our vicinity. 1 of them got to within 3,000 yards of the flagship. We didn't know whether they were carrying missiles or torpedoes, but either one would have caused a lot of problem. But one of our reasons that we got so close is because we had to keep way on, we had to keep moving, and we could only move in certain directions, and unfortunately that direction closed us rather than separated us from the PT boats. The next thing that we knew was things turned black, just as if we'd thrown a switch in a room without windows. The flares had burned out, and the A7 pilot said, this is Raven 1 again. Do you want us to light things up? We each have another flare. And I said, no, I think that the things are taken care of. He said, yes. He said, there are 3 of the PT boats sunk, and my wingman and I are going north and get the one that's limping home about 20 miles north. I said, Roger, this is Blackbeard. You have my authority to cancel your mission over Haiphong tonight. Go home and get a good night's rest. And he said, Roger that. And we headed for home, and the 2 Ravens did the job. And it was, as I say, a very thrilling experience, because we really, I felt, were in danger had we allowed the situation to proceed much further, because as far as we knew, none of the PT boats had been hit before the bright lights came on.